Let me set the stage. Picture a quiet little suburban neighborhood, the kind with trimmed hedges so sharp they could slice bread, and lawns so green you'd think the HOA water bill was sponsored by the Nile River. This was the battlefield, and presiding over it like a self-appointed queen was none other than Karen, the HOA president with a taste for rules, drama, and control so absolute she could have taught Darth Vader a thing or two. Now, Karen wasn't just any HOA busybody. She was the kind of person who thought the world revolved around her idea of community harmony. You know the type. Writing violation letters at 2 a.m. because your Christmas lights didn't match the approved color scheme, or because your mailbox leaned at a 5-degree angle instead of the regulation 4. The woman didn't just enforce rules, she weaponized them. Enter me and my tornado siren. Yep, I had a siren. Not the kind that goes off every 5 minutes like an annoying car alarm, but a real, functional tornado warning siren. Why? Because I value my roof, my walls, and most importantly, my life. When you live in tornado country, a siren isn't a luxury. It's like having seatbelts in your car. You hope you don't need it, but the one day you do, you'll thank every dollar you spent. But not Karen. Oh no, Karen saw my tornado siren not as a safety feature, but as a community disturbance. She claimed it was unsightly, unnecessary, and too loud for a peaceful neighborhood. Yeah, because nothing says peaceful neighborhood like your house being carried 3 blocks over when a twister decides to drop in uninvited. And here's where the HOA madness shines. Karen wasn't worried about whether people lived or died in a storm. Nope. Her main concern was aesthetic uniformity. She said my siren clashed with the architectural spirit of the subdivision. I didn't realize a bright orange funnel cloud cared so much about architectural spirit. But hey, thanks for the design tips, Karen. She even threw in the classic HOA catchphrase, property values. Apparently, she believed the mere presence of my tornado siren would tank everyone's home price. Right, because when buyers are shopping for homes in Tornado Alley, they're saying, well, this one has a storm shelter and a warning siren, but ew, it clashes with the shutters. Totally logical, right? But Karen wasn't done. She held a board meeting. Oh yes, a special board meeting just to discuss how my siren was an affront to community standards. Imagine a room full of people who couldn't define community standards if you handed them a dictionary, all nodding along while Karen painted my siren as the enemy of neighborhood peace. She described it like I had installed a nightclub on my lawn. Here's the kicker. The siren didn't even run unless there was an actual tornado warning. It wasn't like I set it off for fun on Saturday mornings to annoy the neighbors. It was wired into the county alert system, which means if the county issued a tornado warning, the siren would sound. That's it. But apparently, Karen thought Mother Nature should submit an HOA application in triplicate before daring to spin up a twister in her subdivision. The real reason she hated it? Control. Karen loved control, and nothing bruised her ego more than a homeowner taking initiative outside her little rulebook. My siren wasn't in the approved modifications list, which in Karen's world meant it was basically an act of war. So she did what Karens do best. She fired off violation notices, big red letters, legal-sounding threats, and fines stacking up like I'd robbed a bank. She demanded I take down the siren immediately, calling it hazardous. Hazardous to what? Tornado's feelings? This was Karen in her purest form, fighting the one thing that could literally save her life in order to preserve the illusion of HOA perfection. And in doing so, she set the stage for one of the most spectacular cases of cosmic irony I've ever witnessed. Because when the storm rolled in and Karen's peaceful community turned into a debris field, the one thing she wished she'd heard wasn't silence, it was my siren. But Karen wasn't satisfied with just calling my siren an eyesore. Nope. She decided to escalate it with one of the HOA's favorite weapons, the noise complaint. And this, my friends, is where the madness really started to spiral. Now, if banning a tornado siren sounds ridiculous, just wait, because Karen wasn't done.
After the board voted that my safety device was not in compliance with community standards, she pulled out her next favorite HOA weapon, the noise complaint. Oh yes, according to Karen, my siren was a persistent disturbance. Let's pause here. Persistent disturbance. The siren only went off when there was a tornado warning. That's maybe a few times a year, tops. Meanwhile, Karen's yappy dog barked at falling leaves 300 days out of the year, but apparently that didn't qualify as a disturbance. Karen's logic went something like this. A tornado may or may not ever hit us, but your siren might make it noise, and that's unacceptable. It's like complaining that fire alarms are too loud when the house is burning. Sorry, Karen, but quiet neighborhoods don't matter much when roofs are being ripped off and SUVs are flying through the air like kites. And let's get real about this so-called noise. County regulations set very clear decibel limits for residential areas, and tornado sirens are designed to meet those standards. The siren wasn't blasting Metallica at 2 a.m., it was a federally integrated warning system, tested maybe once every few months. That's it. But Karen, of course, made it sound like I was DJing a rave from my rooftop. She filed the complaint officially, slapping me with violation notices that warned of daily fines. Daily. She even included a line that said the siren was offensive to community tranquility. Offensive. As if I'd committed a hate crime against her peace of mind by daring to install a life-saving warning system. The neighbors had mixed reactions. Some quietly told me, "We think the siren's smart. Don't let her bully you." Others, too scared to challenge Karen's reign of terror, stayed silent. And then, of course, there were her loyal lapdogs. Board members who parroted her line about maintaining the aesthetic integrity of this subdivision. Aesthetic integrity? Are we planting tulips or preparing for natural disasters here? And let's get real about this so-called noise. County regulations set very clear decibel limits for residential areas, and tornado sirens are designed to meet those standards. The siren wasn't blasting Metallica at 2 a.m., it was a federally integrated warning system, tested maybe once every few months. That's it. But Karen, of course, made it sound like I was DJing a rave from my rooftop. She filed the complaint officially, slapping me with violation notices that warned of daily fines. Daily. She even included a line that said the siren was offensive to community tranquility. Offensive. As if I'd committed a hate crime against her peace of mind by daring to install a life-saving warning system. The neighbors had mixed reactions. Some quietly told me, "We think the siren's smart. Don't let her bully you." Others, too scared to challenge Karen's reign of terror, stayed silent. And then, of course, there were her loyal lapdogs. Board members who parroted her line about maintaining the aesthetic integrity of this subdivision. Aesthetic integrity? Are we planting tulips or preparing for natural disasters here? And here's where things turned laughable. Karen tried to justify her noise complaint by claiming that emergency management is the responsibility of the county, not individual homeowners. Excuse me, last I checked, counties don't swoop in to save your house in the 5 minutes you've got before a twister drops on your roof. You prepare yourself. You build shelters. You install sirens. You take responsibility for your own safety. But in Karen's world, responsibility meant waiting politely for the county while your shingles did the cha-cha down the block. Now, I could have ignored the notices, but Karen was stacking fines faster than a Vegas blackjack dealer. We're talking hundreds of dollars a week, piling up like confetti at a parade. And the kicker? She hinted at placing a lien on my home if I didn't comply. Over a siren, a literal life-saving device. That's when I realized this wasn't about noise. It was about domination. Karen wanted to prove that no matter what, her rules were supreme, even above common sense and public safety. So I appealed. I sent in documents from the county emergency office confirming the siren was integrated with the official warning system. I cited state safety codes. I even included testimonies from neighbors who appreciated the extra protection. But Karen, she dismissed it all. She said, and I quote, "The board is not obligated to consider external opinions." Translation, logic has left the building. At that point, I had two options: cave in and remove the siren, or dig in and prepare for battle. And you already know which one I chose. Because nothing motivates me more than watching an HOA twist itself into knots to justify nonsense. Karen had officially declared war on preparedness. And as she doubled down on her noise complaint crusade, she didn't realize she was setting herself up for one of the most poetic disasters in HOA history. Because once Karen had the noise complaint locked in, she cranked up the drama. Next came the full-blown HOA flex, threats, fines, and the claim that my siren was killing property values. And trust me, that was just the calm before the storm.
When the noise complaint didn't make me buckle, Karen decided it was time to unleash the full HOA arsenal. And let me tell you, if the violation letters were the opening act, this was the headliner. This was Karen's Broadway debut, complete with dramatic monologues, legal threats, and enough paperwork to kill a small forest. The first flex? Fines. Daily fines. Not occasional slap on the wrist fines. Nope. We're talking a $150 fine for non-compliance every single day that my tornado siren remained on my property. At that rate, she was treating my safety device like it was a parking meter that expired every morning at 8 a.m. By the end of the month, the fines were stacking up like student loan debt. And Karen didn't stop there. She started sending certified letters, the kind that make you feel like you're about to get drafted into the military. Each one full of legal jargon, and she probably copied and pasted from some HOA playbook she found online. Phrases like material breach of covenant and continuing nuisance were sprinkled throughout, as if my tornado siren were a nightclub blasting EDM until sunrise. Then came the property value argument. Oh, the property value argument. Every HOA Karen's favorite buzzword. She stood in front of the board and announced, "This siren is a detriment to our community's appeal. Prospective buyers will be scared away." Scared away? Karen, buyers in Tornado Alley don't flee from tornado sirens, they look for them. That's like saying, I don't want sprinklers in case of fire because it might lower the value of my drapes. But here's the kicker. Karen wasn't just threatening me with fines. She hinted that if I didn't comply, the HOA could place a lien on my home. A lien? Imagine explaining to a judge that your community wants to seize your property because you had the audacity to install life-saving equipment. I could see the headlines already. Local HOA chooses death by tornado over slightly annoying noise. Of course, the neighbors were caught in the middle. A handful secretly admitted they thought Karen was nuts, but were too afraid to say so out loud. Others parroted her nonsense, nodding along about aesthetic consistency, as if synchronized hedges were the ultimate defense against flying 2x4s in a storm. It was like watching people clap for the emperor's new clothes, except in this story, the emperor's house was about to get flattened. And Karen, she strutted around the neighborhood like she had already won. Smug smile, violation clipboard in hand, acting like she was protecting the community from a menace. She even told me once, sometimes sacrifices have to be made for the greater good. Sacrifices? Easy for her to say when the sacrifice was my family's safety, not her precious ornamental fountain. But here's the delicious irony. The more Karen flexed, the more she revealed the HOA's absurd priorities. Safety? Optional. Noise levels? Non-negotiable. Community protection? Secondary. Property values? Sacred text carved into stone tablets. They had twisted the very concept of community standards into a parody of itself. I appealed again, this time bringing actual data. I showed studies proving that neighborhoods with tornado sirens suffer less damage and loss of life. I pointed out that FEMA and the National Weather Service recommend them. I even had county officials willing to confirm my system was properly installed and beneficial. And what did Karen say? The board is not obligated to recognize outside authorities. Translation, we don't care what science, experts, or common sense say, we're the HOA, and that makes us gods.
That's when I realized we were past logic. This wasn't about sirens anymore. This was about power. Karen needed to win no matter how stupid the battle was. And unfortunately for her, she picked the one opponent she could never outrule, Mother Nature. Because while she was writing fines and practicing speeches about community harmony, the skies were quietly brewing a storm that didn't give a single flying shingle about property values or bylaws. And when that storm arrived, it wasn't going to wait for Karen's approval. Because here's where the story takes a sharp, windy turn. The day the storm rolled in, the sky went green, the air went still, and for the first time, the HOA realized they'd silenced the only warning system they had.
You know how in movies there's always that ominous calm before disaster strikes? Birds go quiet, the air feels thick, and someone inevitably says, "It's too quiet." Well, that wasn't Hollywood. It was my neighborhood on the day Karma checked in for its appointment with Karen. The morning started normal enough. Sprinklers ticking, neighbors trimming hedges within the HOA-approved dimensions, and Karen making her daily rounds like a sheriff with a badge nobody respected. But by mid-afternoon, the sky began to change. First came the clouds, dark, heavy, rolling in like an invading army. Then came the silence. No dogs barking, no lawnmowers buzzing, not even kids on bikes. Just a stillness that made your skin crawl. In tornado country, you know that silence isn't peace. It's the universe whispering, "Brace yourself." Now, every other county siren in the area started howling, those familiar, chilling wails that cut through the stillness and send everyone scrambling for basements and storm shelters. Except ours. Thanks to Karen, our neighborhood sat in eerie silence. No siren, no warning, just the sound of the wind starting to howl, like it was laughing at us. Neighbors peeked out their windows, confused. Some even called me, asking, "Hey, isn't your siren supposed to go off?" I had to bite my tongue not to scream, "Yes, it would," if Karen hadn't silenced it in the name of curb appeal. Instead, I calmly reminded them to get somewhere safe, because unlike Karen, I actually cared if my neighbors survived. And then the storm arrived. The sky turned a sickly green, the kind of color that makes your stomach drop. Trees started whipping sideways, debris danced in the air, and the roar? Ugh, that roar. They say tornadoes sound like freight trains. That's wrong. A freight train you can see coming. This sounded like the earth itself was tearing apart. The twister ripped into the edge of our subdivision, sending roof shingles flying like confetti. Street lights bent like straws, patio furniture somersaulted down the street. And right there, in her freshly power-washed driveway, stood Karen, frozen, wide-eyed, realizing the HOA bylaws didn't come with a chapter titled "How to Stop a Category EF3 Monster." The irony was so thick you could spread it on toast. Karen, who had spent months screaming about my unnecessary noisy siren, now found herself screaming louder than it ever could. She ran inside, but by then, the storm was already peeling her house like a tin can. Her precious decorative shutters? Gone. The fancy fountain she bragged about at board meetings? Flattened. Her roof? Let's just say it relocated to a county 2 zip codes over. Meanwhile, the rest of us scrambled to shelters. Families dove into basements, kids clutched their pets, and parents prayed to any deity listening. And in that chaos, every single person thought the same thing. We could have had more warning. We should have had more warning. The kicker is that Karen had argued my siren was too loud, too disruptive. But the storm itself? Oh, it was plenty loud. Louder than any siren ever built. Windows shattered, walls buckled, cars tipped like toy trucks. And through it all, our neighborhood sat silent, robbed of the one tool that could have bought precious minutes. By the time the tornado finally passed, the damage was devastating. Houses shredded, trees snapped like toothpicks, debris scattered for miles. And right in the middle of it all was Karen's house, ground zero for Mother Nature's demolition project. It was almost poetic. She had silenced the siren only to discover that nature had a far louder voice. And while the storm spared no one, guess who got hit hardest? Yep, Karen.
because when karma spins like a tornado, it doesn't just knock politely, it tears the door off its hinges.
Remember how Karen called my tornado siren too loud? Well, irony has a twisted sense of humor, because the night the tornado ripped through, the loudest sound in the neighborhood wasn't my band siren. It was Karen herself. As the storm hit, her house became the main act in Mother Nature's demolition derby. Her beloved shutters, gone. Her fancy pergola, splintered like kindling. That HOA-approved lawn gnome she bragged about in the newsletter, let's just say he went airborne and is probably still touring the Midwest. But the loudest feature of all? Karen's voice. Neighbors later said they could hear her shrieks over the roar of the storm. Imagine that. The woman who thought a siren was a community disturbance ended up out-screaming a funnel cloud. It was the kind of karmic twist you couldn't script if you tried. Now, I don't delight in anyone losing their home. Tornadoes are terrifying, and no one deserves that level of destruction. But here's the thing. Karen wasn't a victim of bad luck. She was a victim of her own arrogance. She chose to silence a life-saving tool. She chose to prioritize aesthetic uniformity over safety. And when the storm came calling, it didn't care about bylaws. It cared about physics. The irony only deepened when emergency crews arrived. They were baffled. Why hadn't the siren gone off? Why didn't this particular neighborhood get the extra few minutes of warning others did? I'll give you one guess, and her name rhymes with Darren. Karen tried to spin it even in the middle of chaos. Standing in her ripped-up yard, hair frazzled, foundation smeared, she told first responders, "We didn't have a warning system." Correction, we did until you banned it. That was like a firefighter pouring gasoline on a blaze and then acting confused about why it spread. And the neighbors? Let's just say sympathy was thin. Sure, people helped her like good humans do in a crisis, but you could see the side eyes, the hushed whispers of, "Isn't this the same woman who got rid of the siren?" The nods of acknowledgement that, yep, this was the price of pride. It didn't stop there. For weeks after, every conversation in the subdivision circled back to Karen's choice. Parents asked, could we have gotten to safety sooner? Elderly residents wondered, would the siren have saved us precious seconds? And Karen? She couldn't answer, because the truth was staring her in the face. Her obsession with control put everyone in greater danger. And yet, true to Karen form, she doubled down. At the emergency HOA meeting held days later, she didn't apologize. Nope. She blamed acts of God, claiming nothing could have prevented the destruction, which is technically true but missing the point entirely. You can't stop a tornado, but you can warn people it's coming. That's the difference between huddling in a basement versus being ripped out of your recliner mid-TV show. Karen's screaming reality check was that she had silenced the one voice that could have mattered most. And in doing so, she ensured her own voice, shrill, panicked, desperate, became the neighborhood's accidental siren. Only problem, unlike my warning system, Karen's screams came too late to be useful. But while Karen's house looked like a blender had chewed through it, mine stood tall. And here's where irony turns from tragic to delicious. Because the house with the outlawed siren, it was the safest one on the block.
Here's the part where karma flexed harder than any HOA ever could. While Karen's house looked like it had been blenderized and spit back onto the block, mine? Still standing tall. Roof intact, windows sealed, storm shelter untouched and stocked with enough supplies to ride out a zombie apocalypse. See, I hadn't installed that siren for decoration. It was part of a bigger picture. Being prepared. Reinforced walls, impact-resistant glass, and a storm shelter that doubled as a man cave when things got boring. While Karen obsessed over aesthetic harmony, I obsessed over something far more valuable, survival. And oh, did that irony shine bright after the storm. Neighbors walked through the debris field dazed, some still clutching pets, others holding whatever they salvaged from their wrecked homes. And there was my place. Basically the only house in the cul-de-sac that didn't look like it had gone 10 rounds with a tornado. People whispered, why is his still standing? I didn't need to answer. They already knew. Karen had labeled my siren unsightly and dangerous to property values, but the real danger was her campaign against preparedness. The truth was staring everyone in the face. The ugly, noisy siren guy had the only house that didn't need a GoFundMe the next morning. Even better, my storm shelter ended up saving more than just my family. During the chaos, a few neighbors who hadn't prepared rushed over when they realized my place was reinforced. We packed into the shelter, kids, pets, snacks, and all. When the storm passed, they hugged me like I was FEMA in a flannel shirt. Try putting that on a property value chart. The real kicker? Karen herself tried to come in. Yup, Mrs. Your Siren Ruins Our Peaceful Community was pounding on the reinforced door, screaming to be let inside. Of course, by the time she got there, the worst had already passed, but you can bet I let her in because I'm not heartless. I just couldn't resist pointing out the irony. Good thing this place is ugly enough to survive, huh? And let's talk about optics. In the days after, the neighborhood looked like a before and after ad for disaster insurance. On one side, mangled homes, snapped trees, twisted mailboxes. In the center, my house, looking smug, practically glowing with the words, "Told you so." If my siren was supposedly lowering property values, then my house surviving raised them back up tenfold. Realtors should have been taking notes. But the best part? Karen couldn't spin it. Not this time. The evidence was too obvious. Her house, wrecked. Mine, solid. Her rules, ridiculous. My preparations, life-saving. The neighbors started whispering, then laughing, then openly questioning why the HOA president cared so much about rules that literally endangered everyone. I didn't even have to gloat. The storm did it for me. Every broken fence post, every shattered window, every overturned car screamed the truth louder than any siren ever could. Preparedness isn't optional, it's survival. Karen's whole argument about community tranquility collapsed along with her roof. Meanwhile, the guy she tried to find into submission had just proven that thinking ahead, even if it's unsightly, is the only real way to protect a community. That's the irony. She wanted silence, but her silence came at the cost of destruction. I wanted warning and preparedness, and my ugly setup ended up saving not just my family, but several of her neighbors too. And if you think Karen walked away humbled, oh no. Because the true storm was only beginning when the HOA held its aftermath meeting. And trust me, that was more chaotic than the tornado itself.
You'd think after a tornado mowed through the subdivision, the HOA would take a breather. Maybe reflect on what went wrong. Maybe admit that silencing the only warning siren in town was a catastrophic mistake. But this is an HOA story, my friends, and logic was not invited to the meeting. 3 days after the storm, when folks were still pulling roof shingles out of their living rooms, Karen called an emergency HOA board meeting. The irony was thick. The neighborhood looked like a disaster zone, yet Karen still thought the most urgent matter was gathering everyone in the half-collapsed clubhouse to spin the narrative. Picture it. Residents with bandaged foreheads, kids clinging to stuffed animals, and neighbors who hadn't had power for 72 hours, all sitting in folding chairs. Meanwhile, Karen stood at the front like she was hosting a TED Talk on how to gaslight your neighbors after Mother Nature wrecks you. She started with the classic line, "This was an act of God, and no one could have prevented it." Technically true, but also missing a skyscraper-sized point. Warning systems don't prevent tornadoes. They prevent funerals. And guess what she got rid of? Exactly. I sat quietly, waiting. Because sometimes the best thing you can do is let people dig their own graves with words. And Karen was swinging the shovel like she was in a speed competition. Neighbors, however, weren't buying it this time. One dad stood up and asked, "Why didn't we have a siren like the other neighborhoods?" Boom. The question that hung over the whole room like a storm cloud. Karen stammered, muttered something about noise complaints, and then tried to pivot to property values. Wrong move. Another neighbor, whose garage was now a pile of matchsticks, said, "Property values? Lady, my car is in Kansas. What property value are you even talking about?" The room erupted in laughter, which was the first time anyone had laughed since the storm.
Karen turned red. She tried to regain control, insisting the board acted in good faith and that no one could have foreseen this level of destruction. That's when I raised my hand, calm, polite, almost saintly. And when she reluctantly called on me, I said, "Actually, I did foresee it. That's why I had a siren. You remember, the one you banned?" You could hear the collective gasp. Some neighbors actually clapped. Karen's face looked like she'd bitten into a lemon. She tried to shut me down, saying this isn't about placing blame, which was hilarious considering she'd been blaming me for months for ruining community tranquility. The more she talked, the more the crowd turned. People were angry. They'd lost homes, pets, keepsakes, and while no one expected Karen to stop a tornado, they did expect her not to remove their only warning system out of spite. It was like banning fire alarms, then acting shocked when the building burned down. The meeting ended in chaos, neighbors shouting, demanding accountability, even hinting at legal action. Karen tried to adjourn the meeting early, gaveling so hard the handle snapped off. But the damage was already done, and not just by the tornado. The storm had ripped through her reputation too. That night, word spread fast. The HOA queen had lost her crown. People were done letting her bully them with aesthetic rules and noise violations. For once, the board wasn't her echo chamber, it was her courtroom, and the verdict was guilty of stupidity in the first degree. And if you think that meeting was bad, just wait, because the next phase was even more brutal. When the receipts came out, Karen's house of cards collapsed faster than her roof.
They say the devil's in the details, but in HOA world, the devil lives in the paperwork. And luckily for me, I kept everything. Every violation notice, every fine threat, every condescending email where Karen called my tornado siren unnecessary. If HOA drama were a courtroom drama, I had a briefcase full of smoking guns. After the chaotic aftermath meeting, I decided it was time to lay it all out. Not with shouting, not with finger pointing, just with cold, hard receipts. So at the next gathering, this time hosted in a neighbor's garage since the clubhouse roof had been peeled off, I brought a binder. Not just any binder. A thick 3-ring beast labeled Karen versus Common Sense. And when I plopped it on the folding table, the sound echoed like a gavel strike. Inside were dated letters, violation notices, and screenshots of emails where Karen explicitly banned my siren. One even read, "Your siren disturbs the peace of the community and will be removed for the sake of harmony." Oh, the irony. That one line alone could have been framed and hung on the wall as Exhibit A, Karen versus reality. I passed copies around, neighbors flipped through them, mouths dropping, whispers spreading like wildfire. They weren't just seeing my side of the story, they were seeing Karen's own words in black and white, confirming everything she'd denied. And the best part, some neighbors had also received petty notices from Karen. Grass an inch too high, garbage cans out a few minutes late, a kid's bike left in the driveway. When they saw how obsessive she'd been with me, it all clicked. This wasn't about noise, this was about power. Karen tried to interrupt, saying, "These documents are being taken out of context." Out of context? Lady, the context was literally, you banned the tornado siren. Pretty hard to misinterpret that one. One neighbor, whose roof was currently being held down by a tarp and prayer, said, "Wait, you mean we could have had extra warning if not for this?" Another, whose dog had bolted during the storm, muttered, "So she risked my family for what? Aesthetics?" The atmosphere turned electric. You could see the tide shift. People weren't just annoyed anymore, they were furious. Furious that their lives and homes had been gambled away for the sake of Karen's obsession with tranquility. Furious that the one person meant to represent their interests had instead silenced their safety. And as if karma wanted to add extra spice, someone dug up a copy of the HOA's insurance documents. Turns out, the board's liability might actually come into play if negligence could be proven. And nothing screams negligence louder than documented evidence of banning emergency equipment. Karen's face turned redder than a stop sign. She tried to pivot again, blaming acts of God, but no one was listening. They had the receipts now, and those receipts screamed louder than any tornado siren. For me, it was vindication. For months, I'd been painted as the difficult homeowner, the guy who wouldn't play nice with community standards. But now, I was the guy who tried to protect the neighborhood, while Karen became the villain who silenced their safety system. And the receipts didn't just lie, they told the whole truth. And that truth hit harder than the storm itself. And once the receipts were out in the open, the whispers turned into action. Because when homeowners lose property thanks to bad leadership, there's one word that always follows: lawsuit.
If you thought the tornado was destructive, you should have seen what happened when the word lawsuit started floating around the neighborhood. Tornadoes rip off roofs. Lawsuits, they rip apart HOAs. After the binder drop and the collective realization that Karen had single-handedly silenced the only siren we had, homeowners weren't just angry anymore. They were calculating. And when angry neighbors start Googling HOA negligence liability, you know the storm isn't over. It's just changing forms. It started with hushed conversations. Folks whose houses had been shredded, families who'd lost pets, seniors who barely made it to safety in time. They whispered, "Couldn't this have been avoided?" And "Don't HOAs have a duty of care?" Then came the local lawyer, because in every neighborhood, there's at least one cousin, friend, or in-law who knows how to file papers. And when he saw Karen's signed violation notices banning the siren, his eyes lit up like Christmas morning. Negligence, he said. Gross negligence. Maybe even reckless endangerment. Now, I'm no lawyer, but even I knew this was juicy. Karen hadn't just made a dumb rule. She'd created liability. By banning the siren, she'd inserted herself and the HOA directly into the chain of responsibility. That meant homeowners could argue that damages weren't just caused by the tornado, but by her deliberate removal of safety measures. Translation, the HOA could end up paying. Suddenly, the board members who'd been Karen's loyal yes men were sweating bullets. Nobody likes the idea of their HOA dues funding Karen's legal defense. One even asked, "Wait, are we personally liable?" You could practically see their loyalty evaporating faster than her fountain did in the storm. Karen, of course, tried to downplay it. "No one can sue us for an act of God," she declared, with the confidence of someone who hadn't read a liability clause in her life. But the receipts said otherwise. The act of God was the tornado. The act of Karen was silencing the one thing that could have mitigated it. Judges tend to notice that kind of detail. By the end of the week, a group of neighbors had officially consulted an attorney. They were exploring damages, negligence claims, and even the possibility of removing Karen as HOA president. It was like watching the beginning of a coup, except instead of muskets and torches, the villagers were armed with subpoenas and legal pads. The atmosphere shifted overnight. Karen went from strutting around like the queen bee to hiding behind closed blinds. The same people who used to fear her violation letters were now sliding notes under her door that said, "See you in court." For me, it was sweet vindication. I didn't need to threaten her. I didn't need to yell. The storm and her own arrogance had already done the work. All I had to do was sit back and watch the HOA unravel under the weight of her decisions. The lawsuit threat wasn't just about money. It was about accountability. People realized they didn't have to live under the reign of an HOA dictator who put appearances over safety. They could fight back. And this time, the law was on their side. And that brings us to the grand finale, the ultimate HOA karma. Because when the board finally had to pick between Karen and the community, let's just say her reign ended faster than her roof shingles flew.
If this story were a movie, the tornado was the climax. The lawsuit threat was the rising action. And the HOA meeting that followed? That was the grand finale. And oh, friends, it was glorious. The board called a special vote to address leadership concerns. Translation, Karen's crown was wobbling, and they were about to knock it off her head. For once, the clubhouse was packed.
not with people worried about hedge heights or mailbox paint colors, but with angry homeowners who'd finally realized the HOA emperor had no clothes. Karen walked in, still trying to carry herself like she was in charge, clipboard in hand, lips pursed, acting like this was just another minor squabble she could strong-arm her way through. But the energy was different this time. The neighbors weren't scared of her anymore. They were done. The first order of business, accountability. One by one, residents stood up and shared how Karen's siren ban had endangered them. A single mom described how she barely got her kids into the bathtub before the tornado ripped through. An elderly couple explained how they didn't hear the county siren far away and nearly got caught in their living room. A dad held up his phone and showed the destruction of his garage, his voice breaking as he asked, "Why did we have no warning?" Karen tried to respond with her usual buzzwords, aesthetics, community tranquility, property values, but each time she was drowned out by groans and laughter. The same phrases that once intimidated people now sounded ridiculous. It was like watching a magician repeat a trick after the audience already figured out where the rabbit was hidden. Then came the motion to remove her as HOA president. The vote wasn't close. In fact, it wasn't just a majority, it was unanimous. Even her old allies raised their hands. And just like that, Karen's reign of clipboard tyranny ended with a single gavel strike. But the karma didn't stop there. With her leadership stripped, the board immediately voted to reinstate the tornado siren policy. Not just mine, they approved a plan to install multiple sirens around the neighborhood. The very thing Karen called ugly and unnecessary became the new standard for safety. It was the HOA equivalent of declaring, "Karen, you were wrong on every possible level." And then came the cherry on top. Whispers that the lawsuit group was moving forward anyway. Removal wasn't enough. They wanted accountability for the damages. If the courts agreed Karen's actions constituted negligence, she could be personally liable. Imagine spending years bossing people around about mailbox heights only to lose your savings because you silenced a warning siren. That's not irony. That's karma wearing steel-toed boots. For me, it was vindication times 10. The guy once labeled a troublemaker was now the neighbor everyone thanked. Parents shook my hand, kids brought me drawings of tornadoes with giant sirens saving the day. Even the board, now Karen-free, admitted I'd been right all along. My eyesore of a siren had gone from community enemy to community hero overnight. And Karen, she faded into the background. No more morning patrols with her clipboard, no more smug violation notices, no more lectures about property values. She became a ghost in the neighborhood she once ruled. Some say she eventually moved out, muttering about ungrateful neighbors. Others claim she's still around, sulking inside what's left of her house, glaring every time she hears the new HOA-approved siren's wail. The ultimate HOA karma wasn't just her downfall, it was the lesson that sometimes the loudest thing you can do is stand up to nonsense. That rules without reason aren't community standards, they're just control tactics. And that when the storm comes, whether literal or metaphorical, it's better to be prepared and unpopular than aesthetic and unprotected. Because at the end of the day, Karen lost her house, her power, and her reputation. And me, I kept my siren, my home, and my dignity. That's not just a win, that's the definition of poetic justice. So the next time your HOA tells you something's unsightly, ask yourself, is it ugly or is it necessary? And remember, when it comes to safety, always be louder than the Karens. If you enjoyed this saga of sirens, storms, and sweet karma, hit that like button, subscribe for more HOA war stories, and tell me in the comments, what's the wildest HOA rule you've ever heard?